Welcome back to Chapter 11 of The Parenting Connection. I'm Pam.
And I'm Jim.
And if you remember, we've been talking the last few sessions about communication, and then we started to talk a little bit about discipline. In this chapter, we're going to talk more about discipline, and we're also going to compare punishment to discipline. So I want to start with a quote, which is that true obedience comes from respect, not fear. And if you remember in the very beginning, was it maybe in the first or second chapter, we talked about parenting styles. And the first parenting style that we talked about is the dictator. And this can also be called the authoritarian parenting style. And what it means is that there's lots of very rigid boundaries. The child has very little freedom. They're supposed to be seen and not heard and do as they're told without questioning. And this is sort of a very old-fashioned or old-style way of parenting, which helped people to fall in line. And in a time when people lived in more feudal societies, like with kings and lots of hierarchy, it made sense that people who were at the bottom needed to obey, because if they stepped out of line, there were terrible consequences. The opposite type of parenting is sort of a doormat. And this was a type of parenting that became extremely popular maybe in the 1960s, where there was lots of freedom, but there weren't really limits, and children were sort of given the freedom to go and be however they wanted to be. The way that we are going to be talking about parenting and discipline is more of a, we call it the connected type of parenting, or it's more of a democratic style. And what it has is there's limits, but there's freedom within those limits. In this type of parenting, there's very little freedom. In this type of parenting, there is freedom, and then as the child gets older, the freedom expands because they're able to do more things. So as they become more responsible, they can handle more freedoms, and you keep expanding that until when they turn 18, they pretty much already know how to limit themselves. And so what we often say is by the time they get older and they're an adult, this is a terrible drawing, but the limits are inside of them. They've already learned, to respect other people's property, to respect other people's space, to conduct themselves in ways that help society function for everybody. So one of the things that is important to know about limits is that children want limits. And why is that? It's because limits bring a certain amount of protection. If you let your children leave the house at the beginning of the day and not come home until evening, it used to be that kids would have neighborhoods and all the parents knew each other, and kids could go out and everybody sort of looked out for each other and everyone knew each other. But today, people live much more independent lives. And so oftentimes people don't even know their neighbors. And that means that there's not enough supervision. So if you let your kids go out and just do whatever they want, bad things can happen. And I give you a little example. When my daughter was young, about 4 years old, we lived in a neighborhood, and there was a new family, and people did know each other, although people were just getting to know each other, I guess. And a group of young children, probably no more than age 6, came to the door. And they wanted to see if my daughter could go out and play with them. And there were no adults with them. And I didn't feel comfortable because I didn't really know like where they were going to be or what they were going to be doing. And so I told her she was too young and she wasn't allowed. They seemed pretty little to be out with that much freedom. And she was very upset with me. But I held my ground. A few years later, I was talking to a neighbor who lived about 3 doors down. She didn't have young children. Her children were grown. And she said, a few years ago, I had gone away to the store and I hadn't locked my door, and I came home and a whole group of young neighborhood children were sitting in my basement like watching television. And I remembered and I thought, oh, so that's where they were. They were going around exploring and doing whatever they could do. And that's the danger. I mean, in that case, no harm was done. But what if they had matches? Or what if there was alcohol there? Or what if there was a dog in there that was really a dangerous dog? Or God forbid, what if there's someone in the neighborhood who's a predator and your children are out roaming around without protection or really knowing people that well? It's an easy way for them to become targets. And so limits matter for children's safety.
So you were just talking about setting limits, and that's a really good thing, you're saying. And that's something we'll need to do as parents many times. Many times. That'll happen over time. And that's what I want to talk about next, over time. And I don't mean overtime as in, hey, this game is going to overtime, right? That's another kind of overtime. This kind of overtime really means what you as a parent are doing day after day. Day after day, year after year.
Your habits.
Your habits, and it's really, that's what we're teaching our kids. The things that we do over and over again. And if what that means is if you have a bad day, or you have a bad moment with your kids, which inevitably we all do, because we're not always on top of our game as parents, it means it's not the end of the world. And that's the good thing. And even if you've really struggled with your kids over certain issues and it hasn't gone well and you didn't know what to do, if you're open and willing to learn, you can always find a way to begin to take it in a new direction.
That's right.
And that's really the good news of over time. It's never too late. You can keep trying and keep being open and look for better ways to do things. But really, again, it comes down to what are our habits as parents? What are the things that we say to our kids and how do we say it? And also, what do we choose to ignore when it comes to our kids, and what do we really focus on? And I've thought of a couple examples here, and some of them seem to have more to do with parenting than others, but they all have to do with what we tell our kids. And one example I thought of may not seem to have much to do with parenting, but it'll just show you how kids learn. Let's say that it's Sunday afternoon. And like a lot of people, you're the kind of parent that likes to sit and watch the football game, right? And not just any game, you like to tune into the Oakland Raiders, right? Your kid learns that, oh, it's Sunday, dad or mom is watching the game and they're watching the Raiders game. So right there, they've already learned something about you. Now, after the game is over, your dad or your mom talks to a buddy and they say, oh, did you see the game? The Raiders won. So there's another instance where they're learning about the importance of the Raiders. Your dad later in the week wears his jersey, his Raiders jersey, and he goes out and buys you a Raiders football. So maybe without ever telling the child directly, hey, I need you to really realize how important football is to me, they'll pick it up. They'll learn that the Raiders are important to you as a parent. Not the Broncos, not the Cowboys, the Raiders, right? Kids can learn that specifically, things that we do. So that's just one kind of example, how we teach our kids, maybe not even by intending to, but we do.
Through our modeling and our actions, and that's part of our family culture, and it makes people feel like they belong.
It does. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We all have things that we like and we're
In our
into.
house, we
and-
like to go camping, or in our house, we always love to go to the pool in the summer.
Right, right. Those things are great. Let's take an example where, and this you'll see has to do a little more directly with parenting. Let's say your child likes to make noise. They like to bang on things. And what you start doing as a parent in response is you yell at your child to stop. And you don't get up to go see what they're doing. You just stay where you are, but you yell, hey, stop it. And maybe the child stops for a moment. And then shortly, they go back to making noise. And again, maybe the next thing the parent does is they yell again. Maybe this time they give a threat too, like if you don't stop it, or maybe they start cursing. And so if that is your response every time the child bangs and makes noise, the child will learn something from that over time. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll learn that they can get your attention by doing that.
They learn that they have power.
They learn that they have power, they can make you respond.
I could really make my parent irritated.
That's right. They learn that they can get in a power struggle with you. So there are things that they do learn from that kind of interaction. They learn what to expect from you.
Right, which is so interesting because my brother was he started drumming on things as a baby, on pots and pans. And so my mom realized that he had rhythm and he loved to drum. So rather than trying to make that go away, she channeled it, and he became a percussionist, and he started taking lessons, and he became a jazz band drummer, and they won awards.
And that's great, and that shows you too that you could take something that annoyed you at first, like a couple times you respond by yelling and threatening, and then you realize, wait, the child likes to do that. Maybe I could work with that, right? So over time, you change your approach, and you can transform that interaction. Instead of it being the same old power struggles, the same old threats, the same old struggles.
Just irritation all the time.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
You can take it in a new direction. Another example might be, let's say that you like to get up before your child and you make them breakfast every day. Maybe it's pretty much the same thing every day. Maybe it's cereal or toast with orange juice or chocolate milk. Your child will learn to rely on that over time. Like, this is what we do. And, that's great. Maybe it's not always quite so set. Like, maybe some days grandma's there and they have something a little different for breakfast. But if you basically set up a routine and then one day you're not there and the child doesn't see the orange juice and cereal and they don't see you making coffee like you usually do, they're going to think, what's wrong? Right? So there is definitely a safety and a comfort that comes in with having a routine over time.
That's right.
That really helps sort of take care of a lot of potential problems.
That's true. So when we think about discipline, we like to think about two parts of discipline. There's prevention, which are the things that prevent having to use a lot of discipline. And then there's intervention, which is more about setting limits. And while discipline means to teach, and so we're always teaching, as Jim said, through the habits that we have ourselves, what we model, etc., there's also more intentional ways to make sure that we're not always just reacting, but that we're more proactive, or we're trying to get ahead of things before they become problems. So one thing that's really important is, as Jim said, to set up structures and routines, and to do this early. And we know that children who feel better physically will be much happier and easier to be around. And how do people feel good physically? They basically eat relatively at the same time every day, and they have food that makes them feel good. If you eat too many carbs or sugar, it creates sort of a burst of energy followed by sort of a lag. So having sort of balanced things like cheese and crackers versus, just a bunch of candy. And so the next thing would be sleeping patterns. Little children need naps. And really tiny children often will nap in the morning and then again in the afternoon. And then they go to bed relatively early because they need a lot of napping or sleep at that point in their lives. As they get older, sometimes they'll drop the morning nap and have an afternoon nap, but that can continue up until the age of 3 or even a little older. And then again, they need to get to bed at a reasonable time, usually by 8 o'clock or so, depending on their age. And they tend to get up pretty early, most kids, because they're excited to be alive and they just want to get going. So it's important to get them into bed so they get enough rest. And if your children are well rested and they're eating well, and they're going to just feel better. So that's going to make your life a little bit easier. It's important to begin these things early so that you're not trying to correct something. You've already had some sort of a rhythm in place, and that continues, as they get older. A lot of people don't realize that adolescents need a lot of extra sleep too. And so they sleep more once they get into their later teenage years. Another thing that's really important is to understand child development, because we know that if we know what to expect at certain ages, then we're not going to be unrealistic in our expectations. If you don't give your children naps and you try to take them to the store at 1 or 2 in the afternoon and it's a nap time, or they haven't slept all day and they're cranky, they're going to be much harder to deal with. So try to take into account what their needs are, what's realistic to expect, and set yourself up for success. A fourth thing that's really important for children in order to prevent problems is supervision. If you know where they're at and who they're with and what they're doing, and I don't mean you have to be with them every minute of the day, but again, it depends on their age. If they're 2, you do want to be with them every minute of the day. You don't want them out running around doing things that you're not aware of. If they're 5 or 6 or 7 and they're with their friends upstairs, you might want to just check in every once in a while, like, what's going on? What are you doing? That way, if they're doing something you don't want them to be doing, or creating some sort of a mess, you can sort of get in there and sort of talk about it before it gets out of hand.
Sometimes the idea will occur to you, I better go check on them. Listen to that idea. That's
right. And maybe they're fine, but just them knowing that you're checking on them gives them a sense that you're there and that you care about them. So along with protection, they also do need space to explore. And again, those things are dependent on their ages and how you're going to handle that. Kids need attention. They need to be connected, and they need to be connected with you, their caregiver. And so don't plan that I have all these things to do today and that they're going to go do their thing. That's partially true, but you also have to be sort of proactive and make sure that they have things to do that are. I used to make Play-Doh, and in the mornings my kids would often play Play-Doh in the morning after breakfast. It just sort of became a routine. Maybe you go outside, every morning and go for a walk or play in the park or play outside. But have some sort of places that they're supervised, and then have things that you plan to do with them for bits of time. Because if you do that, then they're going to be more happy to go off and do their own thing for a while. Sharing power. Parents don't think about power as something that should be shared with children, but they do need to learn how to self-determine. And how do you share power? There's a couple pretty simple ways. One is you teach them to do some things for themselves. Now this is a little tricky. Jim talked about always having breakfast for them. It's really important to nurture children so that they feel valued and cared for and safe. And so maybe you do make breakfast for them every morning, and that's part of your nurturing of them. Or maybe they're very independent, and so they start making their own toast while you get the juice and make the eggs, and then they get a little older and they start to pour the juice, and soon they're helping to make the eggs. So, teaching them skills that make them more independent gives them a sense of power. The other thing that makes children feel powerful is to give them choices, to let them have their own ideas and to let them make some decisions and to learn from that. And the more powerful kids feel, the less they feel they need to take power or find negative ways to get power, like being stubborn or throwing tantrums. And finally, I mean, there's many ways to prevent problems, but I'd have to say that the final thing I really think is important to include is listening. Listening to them. And listening doesn't mean agreeing, but as we've talked in other chapters, listening is about hearing the content and the feeling and putting that together. You wish that you could go with grandma, on vacation. And it really makes you sad that you're not going to get to go to the beach and you're not going to see grandma. So that would be listening. Yeah, I can't, it's not fair. It doesn't seem fair to you. No, it's not fair. And you listen and you don't need to fix it. You don't need to fix it. You just need to let them have their time to express themselves. So that is a little summary of prevention. So, as we said, discipline means to teach. And we do things to try to prevent the need for discipline, but of course we are going to have to set limits on our children. And teaching through setting limits is one of the most basic ways that we discipline our children. There's many ways to do this, which we're going to talk about, but the most effective teacher is what's called natural consequences.
In natural consequences, that's where nature is the teacher. So you don't really have to do anything. It's better in a way if you don't. So what are some examples of that? Let's say your child leaves their bicycle out in the rain. Well, it'll eventually get rusty, because that's what happens to things like that. Or maybe it'll get stolen because they didn't put it away. If your child punches another child, they'll probably get punched back. Mm-hmm. If they jump off a high wall, they might twist their ankle.
They're going to land on the ground. They're not going to go up.
That's right. Gravity is
going
gravity is going to teach them what happens. And unless your child is really going to be hurt by this, like you were saying before about playing with matches.
Or going out in the street.
Or playing in the street, let them learn on their own. That's what natural consequences are about. Let them learn. By all means, be there in a way to observe, or if they come home from school and tell you about something, listen and empathize. But just realize so many lessons in life they have to learn on their own.
You can't overprotect them and have them feel the courage they need to go out into the world.
That's right. Often the best you can do is be interested, be empathetic, but allow them to learn on their own. And by all means, resist the urge to say, I told you so.
It erases the lesson.
Oh, they will think the lesson is that you're a jerk. Honestly, that's what they'll often think.
Right.
Like, why are you telling me? I'm already in pain. Why are you making this harder for me?
That's right.
Yeah. So natural consequences. Let them learn on their own. You be there to observe and to,
support
encourage
them as they learn.
Yeah.
So natural consequences are things that happen without us intervening, but sometimes there are no easy natural consequences and we do have to intervene. So what do we want to think about when we're setting limits? We want to think, is what we're doing respectful? Is it realistic for them at their age? What are we really teaching them? And is it doing any harm? So I want to make a little distinction here. Children being upset is not a terrible thing. So it's okay for us to say no and to be firm with that no. That's not harming them. It's when we call them names or label them or give them really harsh punishments to say no that we get into trouble with the relationship. And as we've said before, the most important thing in a family are the relationships. And the relationships that we have with our children are what allow us to effectively discipline and influence them. So we want to talk about what are some ways that we can set limits. And I want to talk about consequence. A consequence is something that we impose on them, but it's good if it can be like a follow-through of something that happened. So for example, they were wrestling in the living room and they knocked over a plant. They clean it up if they're able. If they're too young, they help to clean it up. Anything that is related to what the problem is. They don't get their homework done on time on their own, and so you set up a special time for them to do their homework, and then you check it before they go to school the next day. It's not like you're really being harsh, you're just giving more limits and more support to help so that they can follow through and learn from mistakes. It's very important that you stay calm and be respectful when you're giving a limit. It's also important that you give a warning. If you do this, then that's going to happen. And then when they do that, you follow through and you make it happen and you're consistent. And so that way they learn that when you say something, you mean it. There's a little technique called ACT, accept the child's wishes, communicate the rule, and target a positive choice. For example, you don't want to turn the television off. That would be their wishes. In our house, we turn off the television while we eat dinner. That's the rule. And a positive choice. You can turn it off or you can allow me to, because sometimes kids would rather do it themselves. Another technique is called when then, and that gives the child to do something that he wants to do after he does something that you want him to do. For example, when you climb down from the counter, then you can have a cookie. When you put your jacket on, then we can go outside. So you're linking what they want with something that you want from them. And as we know, we looked in our yellow book a couple sessions ago, we looked at techniques like describe what's going on, talk about your feelings, say it with a word. There's a lot of ideas in this book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen. And the more tools that you have, the better. Because your children aren't going to need just one tool. People have talked about 1, 2, 3 magic. Yeah, that'll work, but it becomes too much if you only use one tool all the time. So one other thing I want to point out is that different temperaments, which we've talked about, need to be considered in terms of the type of discipline. So what a choleric would need in terms of a really firm boundary, a melancholic probably needs a much lighter touch, for example. And there's lots of books out there. There's William Sears, the Discipline book. There's Jane Nelson, Positive Discipline. But I would really encourage you to look for books that talk about ways to keep your relationship strong while you're setting limits. So we just got done talking about consequences. Jim talked about natural consequences, and I was talking more about logical consequences, things that you make happen as a result of a problem that was created. Now I want to shift for a minute and talk about punishment. A lot of people equate discipline and punishment. And as we've said, discipline means to teach, and punishment means to cause harm. And people feel like, well, I teach through causing harm. And that's true. Kids do learn through causing harm, but sometimes they learn things that you weren't intending to teach. And so I just want to say briefly that for several years when I was much younger, I conducted child abuse investigations. And I saw a lot of children that were hurt seriously but unintentionally because their parents were using some sort of physical discipline that somehow went awry. And through those years, I mean, I was spanked as a child. I don't know if you were ever spanked, Jim.
Not in the usual sense. I'm not going to say my dad never touched me, but...
maybe grabbed you up a little
Something
bit
like
or
that,
was
yeah.
a little bit rough. And so we know that most people have had this sort of thing happen to them, and I even spanked my own daughter. Even though when I had decided not to, became so angry. But because I had decided not to, it was a very brief encounter and short-lived, and we talked about it afterwards. So now I came up with a little list of reasons why I've observed that parents spank and why it may not be always the greatest idea. And we're going to read these to you, and then you can think about it and decide what you think. So, why do parents spank? Well, because it often works well in the short run.
Because they believe it's helpful to the child.
Right. Because their parents spank them, and it shows loyalty to their parents.
Because they're bigger, they can get away with it. The kids are small.
Right. When I was doing abuse investigations, I had situations where the child had gotten older, and even though the parent had physically disciplined them, the parent had gotten a broken nose, and so it can get a little out of hand. Because it's easy.
Because it does feel good to release anger that way.
It does. Because it seems harmless.
And at least a lot in the past, it was socially acceptable.
And I think it still is a lot in certain
It's probably a
circles.
little more questioned now, but still, there's a lot of it, I'm sure.
Right. Why is it not such a great idea? Well, because it humiliates the child.
And I think if we would look at it, we would see that it almost always weakens the bond between the parent and the child.
There's a little less trust there.
Yeah.
Because it can make the child fearful of the parent. So they're less likely to come to them with problems.
It undermines the no hitting rule in the house if you have one. So if you have kids, multiple kids, and you don't want them to hit each other, how is hitting them, isn't that still hitting?
That's right. If you're hitting someone out on the street, you could probably get arrested.
That's right.
Because it can lead the child to fantasize revenge instead of learning about taking responsibility.
The one that you mentioned before, as the child gets older, now that could backfire because kids will not stay the same size, they'll get bigger. Now it could be a real power struggle.
One man in one of our programs said, the last time my mom hit me with the broom was when I took it from her. Because it sometimes causes parents to feel guilty, and then they overcompensate by giving in, which is a really confusing message.
They go from dictator to doormat.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the obvious thing too, the child could be injured. And maybe you wouldn't even intend that as a parent, but it can happen.
I remember a child who the mother was chasing, and the child climbed up on the dresser, and the mother had a belt, and she went to hit the child, and the child jumped just as she was going to hit her, and the belt hit the child and left a imprint of the buckle on her face. So I don't believe that that mother was trying to do that, but it happened, and that's something
As
that,
they say in the heat of battle,
right, and then
things can happen.
you know, something that it's hard for you to sort of take back. So these are just some things to think about and to have conversations with your friends, your family, and really just think about what you think about spanking.
We really covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
Yeah, good stuff. We talked about 3 styles of discipline: the dictator, the doormat, and then the connected. We talked about how we teach our kids and how they learn over time. We talked about all the good things we try to do as parents that really add up to prevention, trying to build relationship with them, pay attention to them, give them power and choices. And then what happens when we have to intervene sometimes and give them a consequence. As far as consequences go, I talked about natural consequences, those things that kids can learn on their own, and we try not to intervene.
Just give them some support and understanding when things don't go well without rescuing. So natural consequences, of course, make sense when it's safe to allow them to experience those consequences. And then we talked about the more logical consequences of having them follow through or make reparations if there's a problem that's being caused, so that they understand the seriousness of it. We talked about the difference between discipline and punishment. Discipline can even be words, like we talked about in How to Talk, so kids will listen. It can be a verbal limit. And we talked about when, then, or ACT, and there's lots and lots of books filled with ideas, 1, 2, 3 magic. And then we talked about spanking. And what are some of the things that you intend to teach, or why we find spanking to be so convenient or effective? And what are some of the things that we don't intend to teach that can be holdovers that last sometimes a lifetime of children feeling very violated or humiliated, or it can really break a relationship when you're trying to have a strong relationship where your kids will respect you and listen to what you have to say. So we did a lot today. Next time we're going to talk about reviewing all the things what we've been learning in these past 11 chapters, and we're going to talk about problem solving, how we can bring it all together to help solve problems with our children, and also do an activity that can help to decrease stress, because part of being a calm, respectful parent is managing our own stress. So we can't wait to see you next time.